Chapter 1, Section 4, we're going to skip right down here to example 1. And we're trying to simplify the radicals. So we're trying to get any perfect squares or any pairs out from underneath the square root sign. So this 8, we're going to break into a 4 times 2. And then that 4, we're going to break down into a 2 times 2 times 2. Now that whole thing is still underneath the square root sign. And square root means what number times itself. Since we have a pair right there, we can take the square root of that. This is actually a 4. Square root of 4 is 2. Or that pair comes outside and you end up with 2 and then the square root of 2. Letter B, you can break this down a couple ways. I'm going to break it down into a 15 times 5. The 15 I'm going to break into a 3 times 5 times 5. Everything there is underneath the square root sign. So we have this pair that's underneath the square root sign. So that comes outside and you're left with 5 square root of 3. Letter C, I'm going to break that down into an 8 times 4. And I'm going to break that down into a 2 times 4. Now see how I have that pair right there? I don't have to break it down anymore if I don't want to. I can, but since I have that pair right there, that would become 4 square root of 2. Letter D, I'm going to break this down into a 4 times 5. The 4 becomes a 2 times 2 times 5. Here we have a pair, so you end up with 2 square root of 5. Letter E, 24, I'm going to break into a 4 times 6. Then the 4 becomes a 2 times 2. The 6 becomes a 2 times 3. Here you have this pair, so that comes out in front. 2 times 3 is 6. Letter F, 150. I'm going to break down into a 15 times 10. The 15 will become a 3 times 5. The 10 will become a 2 times 5. You have a pair of 5s right here. So you end up with 5 on the outside. 2 times 3 is 6. Letter G, I always like the hundreds because you can break that down into 100 times something. In this case it's going to be 100 times 3. And that 100 can be broken down into a 10 times 10, which is a pair. So you end up with 10 square root of 3. Letter H, 125 would be 25 times 5, and since it ends in a 5, you know it would be divisible by 5. And the 25 could be broken down into a 5 times 5 again. There we have a pair of 5s, and your final answer is 5 square root of 5. Letter I, we have this 100 again. I always like these because 100 can be broken down into a 10 times 10. There we have a pair, so it comes outside the square root sign, and you end up with 10 square root of 5. Letter J, that would be a 4 times 3. The 4 can be broken down into a 2 times 2. And then since you have this pair, it becomes 2 square root of 3. Letter K, square root of 50. 25 times 2. That 25 becomes a 5 times 5 times 2. You have a pair right there. So 5 square root of 2. Letter L, 28 will be broken down into a 4 times 7. The 4 can be broken down into a 2 times 2. Those two are a pair, so you end up with 2 square root of 7. Same thing here on the back page, and I'm going to skip ahead to number 3. Now with number 3, we have a number out in front, and we treat things exactly the same. That 8, I'm going to break down into a 4 times 2. Now that 4, I can break down into a 2 times 2. And since I have a pair right here, those come out in front. So it comes outside the square root to the front. And 2 times 3 is 6 square root of 2. Letter B, this 15, I'm going to change into a 5 times 3. The 10, I'm going to change into a 2 times 5. These two are a pair, so it comes outside the square root, and the 2 and the 3 stay underneath the square root sign. Letter C, 27, I'm going to break down into a 9 times 3. That 9 can be broken down into a 3 times 3. These two are a pair. These two are a pair. So everything comes outside your square root sign. And you have 3 times 3, which is 9. Letter D, 5 is going to stay a 5. 32, I'll do 4 times 8. That 8 can be broken down again into a 4 times 2. And see how I have the pair there, pair of 4s? That becomes 4. 5 times 2 is 10. So 4 square root of 10. Letter E, that 27 will be a 9 times 3. The 6 will be a 2 times 3. That 9 can be broken down again. So we have a pair right here, which crosses out and goes out front. And then we have a pair right here, which crosses out and goes out front. 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27. And then we still have this square root of 2 left. Letter F, that 6 can become a 2 times 3. The 12 can become a 3 times 4. And that 4 can be broken down into a 2 times 2. So we have a pair of 2's, we have a pair of 3's, and then we have that 3 out in front. So these 2 come out in front, these 2 come out in front, and then that one is left under the square root sign. 3 times 3 is 9, times 2 is 18, times the square root of 2. Letter G, 3 times 2 is 6 in front of the square root sign. The 4 will become a 2 times 2. The 8 will become a 4 times 2. And that 4 becomes a 2 times 2. So here you have a pair, here you have a pair. So those both come out in front. This one stays underneath. 6 times 2 is 12, times 2 is 24, square root of 2. Letter H, that 18, I'm going to write as a 6 times 3. That 6 will become a 2 times 3. These 2 are a pair, so you will have 3 times 5. So your final answer is 15, square root of 6. And example 4, way before I was around, somebody made a rule that says you cannot have a square root on the bottom of a fraction. So what we do is we multiply the top and the bottom by the square root of 3. Square root of 3 over square root of 3 is just a 1. And then you end up with the square root of 3 over the square root of 9. This is a perfect square, so you end up with square root of 3 over 3. And if that didn't make sense, there's actually a shortcut. Notice the square root of 3 was on the bottom of a fraction and it moved to the top. And then this number was underneath the square root and it came outside. So this square root of 7 moves to the top of the fraction, and then below it comes outside the square root sign. This moves to the top of the fraction, so 2 square root of 7, and then this comes outside the square root sign. This moves to the top of the fraction, and then this comes outside the square root sign. Letter E, the square root of 6 moves to the top of the fraction, and then it comes outside the square root sign. Now one more thing here, 4 over 6 can be reduced, so that would be 2 square root of 6 over 3, and the 4 6 reduced to 2/3. Letter F would be 2 square root of 11 over 11. Letter G, 4 square root of 10 over 10. And again, that 4 over 10 can be reduced, so 2 square root of 10 over 5. And we're going to skip letter H.